Good evening, and thanks for coming out. This is an opportunity for everybody to find out what our new Canadian Polar Commission is going to be doing following the conference. We've got a lot of great ideas that have been floating around, a lot of wonderful science that has been done during the International Polar Year, and now to some extent it's up to the Polar Commission to be that conduit to government to take us to another level. And I'm wondering whether or not you've had a chance to digest things here. Where do we go from here with all the information we've got?
Well, let me just start with a little bit of a historical perspective. The Polar Commission back in 2000, more than a dozen years ago, was involved in promoting the International Polar Year. And I don't think we or anyone else had a very good idea what would become of this effort over the last decade. But even in the planning phase, we were thinking about the legacy. And one of the legacies was to make sure that the science, the understanding of how the Arctic was changing, how the polar regions of the world were changing, would be connected into decisions that policymakers, that communities, that industry would have to take as we go into the future. And so this isn't something that we're only starting to think about at the end of the polar year, this connection between knowledge and understanding and future decision making. And so I think the Commission has been positioning itself, and many other organizations have been positioning themselves over the last few years to make sure that that connection that becomes very strong between the research programs, the observing initiatives, and the type of information that's very useful to people who are going to use it in the future.
Oh, so Bernie, give me an example of something that's useful, that's come out of IPY that we could act on now.
Well, thanks, Ed. There are certainly a lot of things that could be acted on, and I would dare say there are things that are being acted on. I'm not sure, though, that the equation knowledge to action it's not quite as simple and linear as that. There is a possibility of the two living in isolation. You can have knowledge without action. You can have action without necessarily having knowledge. I like to use the analogy of the space program in the 60s when President Kennedy said, we're going to put a person on the moon by the end of the decade. And what that did is it unleashed a range of research options from textiles to rocket propulsion that lasted not just a decade but well beyond that. And I think what we will probably take away from this is the need for a galvanizing vision that can perhaps bring into perspective these points of light in the dark skies, I call them, and start drawing constellations that make sense. And I can give you an example. If we could launch a period of learning to live, work, and play in the Arctic, this would obviously give a broad scope for bringing together all of these little nodes, because unfortunately there's a possibility that the Arctic is seen from different perspectives, and they're all valid. At one level it's a homeland, at another level it's a frontier. Some see it as a wilderness, and others see it primarily as a laboratory. And that balance has to be created, and we have to realize that it's no longer this isolated region. It's no longer a boutique issue, it's a mainstream, and I would dare say the geopolitical issue for the 21st century. And it involves not just the Arctic regions or the Arctic states. And I think what we're seeing here from this interest level is that it really is touching global affairs now. So there's not a nice, neat linear path, but there are certainly, if you were in one of the sessions today, you can hear all sorts of ideas about how you put into action what we're hearing around us. The thing is, though, it's not a very finite and definite action that will make the difference. It's a whole paradigm shift that we're looking at, and it'll take generations.
But it is also time sensitive, wouldn't you say? I mean, that this information that we've collected, this body, this large group of people that we've assembled over this period of time, that the longer we wait, the staler the information gets, and the more stagnant our move forward becomes.
Yeah, I think that's true. Certainly this information is very timely. During IPY we had research programs that established new baselines, and how we move that into a decision-making framework is something that it will require a little bit of work. But what I've observed over the last few years is the scientists themselves have taken on more of that responsibility, realizing that they need to find ways to translate information in a way that's accessible to users that have different requirements. So it's like a life cycle, right? We ask a question, then we can interrogate databases, we can talk to our colleagues, we can talk to experts. If we need to collect new information, we have to design a program to do that. If the information is already available, we have to determine whether it's timely and accessible and how we use it. And both of those streams create new knowledge. But we have to constantly be feeding that back into a process of knowledge translation so it's available to decision makers and others. And I think we got much better at that during the last few years, in large part because of International Polar Year. So that life cycle of knowledge generation and knowledge utilization and knowledge translation and knowledge preservation is in much better shape than it was at the beginning of IPY. So most of the pieces are there. The question is, can we sustain it, and how will we take advantage of what we've been able to do?
And there's a role to play for various levels of government as well. And Bernie, you're an expert going back to the Northwest Territories years ago. Have we made progress in that area? The cooperation between governments, different levels of governments, and I'm including Indigenous governments here as well.
I think actually, yes, there's been a quantum leap in governmental cooperation. I've seen a lot of it myself in the Arctic Council process, where we have 8 Arctic states that have come together with 6 international Indigenous organizations, and they do a lot of wonderful collaborative work in the science field, but also now more increasingly in very positive and in some cases legally binding measures. There is a next generation of work that needs to be done, and we need to be able to take that intergovernmental cooperation to the international level. There are a lot of non-Arctic countries and non-Arctic interest groups that have to become part of the dialogue because, as we know, a lot of the big forces driving change in the Arctic are not from the Arctic. They're from the middle latitudes. So have we made a difference in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years? Absolutely. I think governments are going in the right direction in terms of Arctic cooperation, but the challenges are increasing. And I would just say I don't think that the knowledge that we've seen here has a shelf life. I don't think we need to worry about it going out of fashion. Newton did his work on gravitation many centuries ago. We still use it today. There's lots of room here for growth, and I think what we'll learn here is that not all knowledge is necessarily actionable, but there are pieces of knowledge that require us to act, and that's the key, is to sort those and figure out what they are and then do something about it.
Does the fact that the Arctic Council is coming to Canada and next year, the year after, provide us with an opportunity to focus on these issues internationally?
Sure. It's important that the Arctic Council chairmanship returns to Canada for the first time since the creation of the Arctic Council, and of course that's an opportunity both in Canada to focus attention on the outcomes of IPY, but also for the Arctic Council itself to evolve. And that's what as Bernie alluded, that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the working groups of Arctic Council, the cooperation among the working groups and with other organizations, starting to reflect the diverse sources of information and the type of questions that people need answers to in a timely fashion. So one of the Arctic Council initiatives right now is about Arctic resilience. And there's another initiative on adaptation to Arctic change. And so we see, and there's collaborations with a number of other organizations in non-Arctic countries on sustaining Arctic observing networks. So we see increasingly Arctic Council reaching beyond the Arctic states and the Arctic residents to include a global perspective. And when we take a look at the full breadth of IPY, yes, we learned about the polar regions, but we really learned about how the polar regions affect the entire planet.
Well, thank you both for coming, and I urge everybody, if you want to know a little bit more about the Canadian Polar Commission, they've got a wonderful website. They've just come out with a new report on IPY highlights, and we're going to see a lot more coming from them in the months and years down the road, and I think they're an organization to be watched. So thank you very much both for coming.